Our last talk of the day is implications of planting depth recommendations. And I'm Peter Thomison. I'm the OSU corn extension agronomist, and I'll be addressing this subject. This is a project that our Alex Lindsay is involved in. He's a relatively new faculty member. He's an agro-ecophysiologist at Ohio State. And Paul Carter, who we saw mentioned earlier today. Paul Carter is the senior agronomist with Pioneer, who's helped with the structuring of this project. Now, I think that sometimes I've mentioned input in the title originally. I wasn't exactly sure what I was talking about, so I put input there. And I guess, Emerson Afsinger referred to planting data as an input, so I think it's legitimate to talk about planting depth as an input. So I'm getting away with that. So currently, our recommendations for planting depth, if you look at the agronomy guide, we say an inch and a half to 2 inches. And we say deeper plantings are recommended under drier conditions. And I think that's certainly appropriate. I think many extension agronomists, seed company agronomists, crop professionals who are involved in making these types of decisions would certainly recommend planting deeper than that, especially when we're in late May or early June and the prospects or the extended weather forecast suggests that we may be waiting for some rainfall. It's certainly appropriate to be planting into soil moisture, even if it means going down to 3 inches or deeper. In fact, I think the current recommendations for corn right now, planting depth recommendations, I get the feeling, talking to a lot of folks in this who are looking at this right now, is that probably most crop professionals are looking at more like 2 inches or 2 inches plus as a standard recommendation. Now, nevertheless, many growers, many producers, planting early, plant shallower than an inch and a half. They may be planting an inch. They may be doing that deliberately, or if they're shooting it for an inch and a half, given the size of their equipment, the condition of their fields, there's going to be some rows that they plant which are not an inch and a half. They're going to be shallower than an inch and a half just based on the planting operation. The reason some growers cite for planting shallow is that the seed will emerge sooner with warmer temperatures. If they're planting the first week of April, it's dry. It's dry then, they're planting, but they know that given Ohio's history in the spring, that they may run into a wet-cold period, or maybe there's a wet-cold period in the forecast. They want to plant shallow. They say the corn will come out of the ground faster if they plant shallow. And they kind of bristle when I mention planting it 2 inches deep. They think, now, you're going to seal the corn in the ground, but after those heavy rains that come in. That was a concern last year when we mentioned, Emerson was mentioning we had the same thing here. A lot of our corn got planted in April. I think it wasn't quite as much as yours, but we were in that 40 to 50% range. And we also experienced record replanting in Ohio. People were concerned that, if you plant early or if you plant before these heavy rains, you're going to get crusted. And these shallow plantings are better in these situations. But shallow plantings have risks. They increase stress. That seed is closer to the soil surface. It's exposed to temperature swings in soil moisture. They increase stress. There's increased potential from injury from certain pre-emergent herbicides. You get less developed roots near the soil surface, again, due to those temperature and moisture swings. Smaller stalk diameters and smaller ears, and then these factors translate into lower yields. A lot of this is empirical data that's been made as far as these types of observations. Now, surprisingly, work on planting depth is relatively limited. I think to understand the risks associated with shallow planting, it helps to take a look at the process, the germination process in corn, and the early vegetative development. And this is a nice picture from Bob Nielsen showing an early seedling development. We've got a nice picture of the corn root system. And the structure I want you to pay attention to is, well, first step is this white tubular structure referred to as the mesocotyl. And it's coming out of the seed. And this picture applies to corn that's planted about an inch and a half to 2 inches. I think this is very representative of that ideal environment and development we'd like to see in our corn plant. So we've got our corn an inch and a half to 2 inches below the soil surface. The mesocotyl is elevating the growing point to the soil surface. and about 3/4 of an inch to a 1/2 inch below the soil surface, the growing point stops, and we get the development of the crown roots forming. The crown roots, the secondary roots, the nodal roots, however you want to refer to them. The corn plant, the corn seed is sort of pre-programmed to develop these roots about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch below the soil surface. Now, in situations where we're deeper, we plant deeper than 2 inches, and we can probably plant our corn belt hybrids as deep as 5 inches or 6 inches under ideal growing conditions. You take them into the greenhouse and put them in sand, we can get them deeper, probably germinate at depths deeper than that. But we have this structure, as I mentioned before, the mesocotyl helps us out. So if we go from 2 inches to 2.5 to 3 inches, that mesocotyl will elongate. And it takes the growing point and establishes the crown roots up to about a 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch below the soil surface regardless. The problem that arises with shallow plantings is we're looking at that when we're very close to the soil surface is the mesocotyl is not really needed. Its function is limited, and we're developing right at the soil surface. So those nodal roots, instead of developing a 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch below the soil surface, are going to be developing much closer to the surface. And we can see that here in this picture. This is a diagram or a figure that just shows a range of planting depths. This is 2.5 inches on the left, 0.5 inches on the right. Planting depth determines the placement of nodal roots, which are developing too close to the soil surface in the shallow planted corn, which is on the far right here. We can be at different depths here, but you see our nodal roots are forming, whereas near the soil surface they're not forming. And the situation with the nodal roots, difficulty with getting nodal root establishment at the shallow planting depths, probably the most prominent or most egregious example of that is the rootless corn syndrome that occurs. And this is the phenomena that can lead to the floppy corn syndrome. And this is pretty widespread, and it really, in many cornfields, I think it occurs and growers aren't even aware of it because corn plants start flopping over following a windstorm, and many times those windstorms are associated with rain, and the very wind that blows over the corn and brings the rain actually ends up resurrecting these plants. The plants, in some worst case scenarios, we'll see a floppy corn field where we have lots of corn laying on its side, maybe attached to the soil by a single nodal root. But those are observed on a fairly infrequent basis during the growing season. I'd say we get maybe 1 or 2 reports a year possibly, but generally it's not a widespread problem. But the impact of the shallow nodal root development is more pronounced on development of the corn plant as it affects later vegetative growth. And in this picture we're seeing we have one of these later emerging plants associated with shallow planting. It's 2 stages below its neighbors. We got most of these plants are at the 7-leaf collar stage. This one plant that's kind of stunted is at the V5 stage, and you can see it's going to have less access to light and probably have, because of its size, less competitive for water and nutrients. And of course, many times these plants are fairly normal. Later as they develop, we can't really see that much of a difference, but there may be some subtle differences at soaking. In this case, we have a plant that it's 2 leaf stages behind its neighbors. Looks fairly normal in size, but it's late to soak. And because of that, it may not access the pollen, and the pollen, so it may have limited access to pollen, and that may result in reduced kernel set. And it also, when you have these scattered plants in the field that are soaking late, they're often the targets of Japanese beetle damage, western rootworm beetle damage. They kind of zero in on these plants because there's just scattered plants across the field. When the whole field's soaking, those insects are diluted, so to speak, but when they're just these scattered plants, they kind of zero in on these plants, and they can do considerable damage to them. You can end up with plants that either have reduced kernel set or even major kernel set because of the damage from these soak-feeding and pollen-feeding insects. Now, we've done some studies looking at planting depth. We did a study for Pioneer several years ago, and they were actually looking at the possibility of certain hybrids being more appropriate for shallow plantings. Basically, their thinking was that we have growers out there who are interested in planting shallow because of their concerns about cold weather early in the spring. Let's see if we have some hybrids that might work for them. And what we did was we basically looked at hybrids with different drought tolerance ratings to see if those hybrids might be better in shallow plantings. And what we did was we looked at some very shallow plantings, a half an inch and a half, and 3 inches. And we looked at hybrids ranging, which had different root rating scores, or not root rating, drought tolerant ratings. And we found that there was really no difference as far as the way these hybrids responded to planting depth. We found one hybrid, the drought tolerant hybrid, did do better each time, but it was not a case of, we didn't see any differential response to planting depth. Of course, we saw effective planting depth in our study. When we looked at, we were doing this in conjunction with our corn performance trial. We have 10 locations in that test, and we were sort of piggybacking on the end of that test, and we're putting out these trials at each location. And in each one of these locations, as I mentioned before, we had these 3 different depths we established, 0.5, 1.5, and 3 inches. And with the variables, we measured yield, population, and late emerging plants, which we referred to as runts. And we saw, as far as yield was concerned, that we saw yields that were almost 50% greater for the 1.5 and the 3-inch planting depth. There wasn't much there was really no difference between 1.5 and 3 inches. When we looked at population, that was contributing to the differences in yield, and certainly contributing to the lower yield at a half an inch. We were seeing populations that were less than 20,000 plants per acre compared to 31,000 to 32,000 plants per acre for the 1.5 and 3-inch depth, and we saw about 5 to 6 times more late emerging runts in that half-inch planting depth treatments. So this certainly set the stage for the impact that this can have, these late emerging plants that can result from uneven, or not uneven, but shallow plantings. Now, recently, I think in the more than the last couple of years, we've heard talk about the statements like uniform emergence is critical for achieving high yields. And I know some of the top producers, some of the top corn producers in contests have said farmers cannot reach top yields if they have some plants that are emerging 1 or 2 days late. A 24-hour difference in planting date or emergence date has been linked to significantly reduced yields. I don't know if we have a lot of university data that supports these contentions, but that's what those statements are out there. And I think that planting date is being looked at, or we're hearing more about planting date as a major factor contributing to uniform emergence, as a factor that needs to get more attention. Now, there have been some studies involving universities and some of the machinery, some of the equipment companies that suggest that variable rate seeding depth plantings within fields may improve corn yield, especially when soil moisture conditions are less than ideal. So in addition to dealing with all the other data we have to deal with these days and trying to make sense of it, there's some thoughts now that we should be looking at variable rate seeding. But our knowledge of corn response to planting depth across different soil types and conditions is very limited. So we have some technology out there that promises to maybe make some adjustments, but we really don't have background information yet. There's new tools that may enable monitoring of soil moisture during the planting operation. One tool is this one from Precision Planting called the Smart Firmer. It was launched this past year. I think it's going to be available commercially this year. Now, it purports to measure our soil organic matter. These are done with our optical sensors, but for our purposes of the discussion today is that one of the things that's going to be it indicates that it can measure seed germination moisture, uniform soil moisture consistency, and soil temperature. Because soil temperature and soil moisture are key as far as germination and, of course, uniform emergence. So a greater understanding of the influence of soil texture, soil moisture, and soil temperatures on seeding depth is needed to assess the potential and maybe the implementation of variable rate technology. We don't have that information really right now. So we started a study in 2017. There were 2 research questions we wanted to address. What is the variability of temperature and soil moisture at different planting depths? Basically, we want to look at the fluctuations in soil moisture and temperature at different planting depths. And how does varying planting depth impact emergence rates and grain yield? Well, we conducted this study at our South Charleston research farm, which is about 40 miles west of Columbus. We did it at 2 fields on a Crosby soil series. This is has a silt loam soil texture, 2.7% organic matter. And we did it on a Kokomo soil series in another field adjacent to it, about 500 feet away. We tried to pick 2 different soil types in relatively close proximity. And it has a higher organic matter, 4.4% organic matter. Sometimes people refer to the Crosby as our light-colored soil, it's a lighter-colored soil, and the Kokomo is a dark-colored soil. We did these in 4-row plots, established 4-row plots, 10 by 150 feet in length. We had 3 targeted planting depths, 1 inch, 2 inch, and 3 inches. Planted Pioneer 1197 at 35,000 seeds per acre on May 16th. We planted field 1, the Crosby field, we planted at 9 a.m. and then we went over to the Kokomo field and we planted at 12 p.m. And the idea is we were trying to get these, as what as it was last year, this was a window of time for us. We got in there and we tried to get these things established as quickly as possible, and because we knew there was rain on the horizon, we had been waiting for several days just to get these plots established. So this panel of pictures here shows the sensor installation we followed. On the far left, you can sort of see the furrows. I don't know, can you see the furrows, Harold, there? The seed we just planted. We did this within an hour of planting. We were establishing these cables, but we established a trench which was perpendicular to the planted furrow. And then we removed that trench, the soil from the trench. We installed a sensor which was going to measure soil moisture and temperature, and we actually had soil conductivity, other parameters. We installed those tines at the different planting depth. Depending on the treatment plot or what the plot treatment was, we established those sensor tines in the furrow at that particular planting depth. As you can see in this panel over on the far right, and then we backfilled. So as I said, we did this within an hour of planting. We connected it to a data logger. Here's Alex Lindsay, Dr. Lindsay out there. We had cables everywhere. Just a massive cables. Alex had trained a crew of students and grad students in the lab, kind of like a pit crew. They could do this they went through the practice of establishing these cables in the lab, laying them out, so that when we got to the field, we could do this really fast, because we didn't want to spend a lot. We wanted to try to get these 2 fields established as close together as possible. We recorded average soil moisture and soil temperatures every 10 minutes. We amassed a tremendous amount of data. So we collected as the seeds. That was on May 16th. Starting on May 17th and until June 2nd, we were actually monitoring the fields on a daily basis. Early on, of course, it was too early, but we went ahead at around 11 o'clock every day. We were shooting for 11 o'clock. We were going out and monitoring the spikes in the plots to see what was emerging, what was a BE. And every time we went out and we saw new spikes emerging, we put a little stake next to them with the date. Here, this one says 5/21. And we had 2 sections. We'll talk about that in a second. We had 2 sections within each row of where we established these cables. And we established the cables in this V3 section here, but we had a 10-foot section and a 5-foot section within each plot. The 10-foot section was harvested at the V3 stage, or what was approximately V3 for most of the plants. We actually went ahead and staged all the plants when we dug them up. And we dug them up and measured to determine biomass, what the dry matter was of those plants, these seedlings. And we determined the actual depth to the seed. Even though we were shooting for 1, 2, and 3 inches, we actually recorded the actual planting depth. And then we determined plant spacing. Now, actual planting depth was seed to color change. That was we actually took a magic marker, a Sharpie, and we went out and we put a Sharpie mark right at the soil line. And we measured from that soil line to the seed. And that was our actual planting depth. Now, in extension, a lot of times we'll say, well, you can determine planting depth by measuring the mesocotyl and adding half an inch or 3/4 of an inch. But we were wanting to, a lot of times, especially when you're dealing with shallow plantings, if you measure the mesocotyl, you're measuring sometimes a mesocotyl that's kind of wrapped up in a coil, and it really doesn't tell you anything about the planting depth. So this was our actual planting depth. We did measure extended plant mesocotyls, but this wasn't used to determine this wasn't determined to determine actual planting depth. We also had another strip. That was the one I just showed you before. This was a 10-foot strip. This was a 5-foot strip, and this is where we collected data at a little bit after the physiological maturity, black layer. This was a 5-foot section harvested by hand. This is where we wanted to determine yield and per plant yield. We measured here also planting depth. This may surprise you, but at the R6 stage, when the plant has reached black layer, you can still find a mesocotyl if you dug up these roots. There's a circle there around what's left of the mesocotyl. In this particular case, I don't know if you can see a shriveled seed, but nearly all of the plants actually had a shriveled seed attached to that mesocotyl within that mass of nodal roots. And we determined the depth to the seed from that shriveled seed to the soil line at the R6 stage. So this was another measurement of actual seeding depth. And this was our plant. We also measure plant-to-plant spacing and per plant grain yield and plot yield for the 150-foot section that we measured. Okay, let's now turn over and look at some of our results. Okay, let's start off with the Crosby, or what I referred to as the lighter soil. As I mentioned, our target depths were 1, 2, and 3 inches. The actual depths we achieved, and this was in that 10-foot V3 section, was 1.1, 1.6, and 2.4. They were significantly different, but they were shy of what we were shooting for. Now in the other section, the 5-foot section, which we harvested at R6, the actual depths corresponding to 1, 2, and 3 inches were 1.2, 1.6, and 2.5. So they weren't exactly on target, but they were significantly different and consistently deeper. Okay, there's a lot in this figure, so I'm going to kind of go through it with you initially. This is a figure that shows basically the temperatures at the different planting depths. We've got the 1-inch depth is in blue, the 2-inch depth is in red, the 3-inch depth is kind of a gray-green. The orange circles are air temperatures, ambient air temperatures, and the blue lines are precipitation. And we're starting over. We've got temperature on our y-axis, our vertical axis over on the left, and we've got precipitation on our vertical axis on the right. And we planted on May 16th, but we had some problems with our data logger, so we actually don't start seeing data as part of a continuous graph until May 17th, and we did this through June 2nd. So what you're looking at is those 3 graphs, and just some overall comments about those. You can see the daily swings in temperature. The soil temperatures tended to be greater than air temperatures. The widest variance in temperatures was seen at shallower depths, with shallow depths being warmer than deeper depths. And precipitation events seemed to lessen the differences between soil depths. Now, I was very surprised when I saw this graph because beginning around May 18th, we had it seemed a very wet emergence period. We had 5 inches of rain over this emergence window. Very muddy, very wet. I thought basically I thought the moisture that we experienced with saturated soil conditions we experienced might basically obscure or mask any differences in temperatures we saw. But we did see differences in temperature. You see, at the end of our run here, we were actually getting temperatures at the 1-inch depth that were exceeding 90 degrees. And in a Kokomo field, we actually had 3 days that had temperatures above 90 degrees. So now let's look at these different temperature depths. At the 1-inch depth, the average daily temperature was 68.9 degrees. At the 3-inch depth, it was 68 degrees. So it was about 1 degree difference. The average temperature range was 17.8 at the 1-inch depth, which is much greater than it was at the 3-inch depth. These were significantly different, which was 11.7, about a 6 degree difference. And again, this surprised me given the fact that we were looking at such a wet environment that we were dealing with. Because as you can see, as things started to dry out, we started to see things separate at the end there. Now let's look at water content in the soil at these different planting depths. And of course, We're looking at basically the same colors. 1 inch is blue, 2 inches is red, 3 inches the gray-green. And we're looking at on the y-axis over on the left, we've got volumetric water content. On the right, we have precipitation again. And I've left, even though we don't have a temperature on one of the axes, I've left the graphs for temperature on this figure as well, just to show you some the relationships between precipitation and temperatures. We have two lines on this one. The upper line there, it says FC. The blue line up there is field capacity, which is 38%. And you can imagine with those saturated conditions, you can see that we got close to field capacity at the 1 inch depth. And then we have the permanent wilting point at 14%. So we have our three graphs there with the different colors. At the 1 inch depth, the daily volumetric water content over this period was 28.7. At the 3 inch depth, it was 29.2. No, we didn't see really a significant difference. But we did see a significant difference for the range in volumetric water content, the max versus the min. The percent was at the 1 inch depth, it was 3%. At the 3 inch depth, it was 1.1%. So shortly after we planted the study, we looked at these different depths. The 2 and the 3 inch planting depth, the water content was greater than at the 1 inch depth. After we had those heavy rains, we had nearly 4 inches of rain from about May 18th through May 21. We were looking at as you might expect, at the 1 inch depth, water content was greater than it was in the 2 and 3 inch depth. And then as things dried out, we saw that there weren't any differences between the 1, 2, and 3 inch depth. And you can see these in relationship to the temperatures that we were looking at previously. Now these figures show the relationship between cumulative emergence date and cumulative emergence. For our 10-foot section, for our V3 section, and our 5-foot section at R6, where we collected yields. And what we found was that the first planting depths to emerge, as you might expect, were the 1 inch depth. But what we found was the time it took to go from 10% emergence to 90% emergence was actually greater at the 3 inch depth, 2.5 days, than it was at the 1 inch depth, 4 days. And the 2 inch depth was intermediate. And that was for the V3 emergence curves. And then for the R6 emergent curves, we saw something similar. At the 3 inch depth, we actually, from the time it took from 10% emergence to 90% emergence, we actually saw a shorter period of time, 2.5 versus 4.5 days. Okay, this figure shows we've got several different, we're looking here at the biomass versus depth, seeding depth. Our figures at the top indicate the relationship between seed depth and plant per plant biomass. And this is the V3 plants on the left, and then the actual per plant yields on the right. And this is looking at biomass versus depth to seed on the right, and then yield versus depth to seed on the left, on the right, I should say, and left. Just correct myself. And then these bottom tables indicate the actual targeted depth differences. So if we look at the targeted depth differences in this table on the left, the average date of emergence, the average date for the 1 inch depth was 22.1. That would have been days after the May date, and then 22.4. For the V3 biomass, we're actually finding that the biomass was greater at the 3 inch depth, a little over 1 gram versus 0.89 at the 1 inch planting depth. The 2 inch planting depth was intermediate. For the yield per plant and plot yield and the date emerged, average date emerged was, again, we saw the 1 inch depth, it was earlier than it was for the 3 inch depth. And I should correct myself on the one for the V3 depth, actually it was the 2 inch depth which was the first one to emerge. The yield per plant, we didn't see any significant differences, nor did we see significant differences for plot yield. But when we looked at the figures, now the figures contain, each one of those circles represents a plant. the depth of the actual the biomass of a seedling at V3. So it represents that seedling associated with the actual planting depth. And as you can see, the trend line that we see here indicates that we were getting larger, and it corresponds or supports what we saw on the table. We were seeing greater biomass associated with deeper planting depths. And also in our figure that shows the relationship between per plant yield and seed depth, we saw that the trend line indicated that we were seeing larger plants associated with deeper seeding depths. Now these figures show the relationship between per plant biomass and emergent state, not planting depth here, and per plant yield versus emergent state. And here, as the emergent state increased, the biomass and per plant grain yield decreased, regardless of planting depth. Now let's switch gears and talk about the results from our Kokomo soil, the darker soil. This field, again, was in close proximity to the Crosby field. And it was one that you would expect. The results that we saw were different than what I was expecting, but this field was a field that was slightly wetter. We saw ponding on the edge of this field. It seemed to be more saturated than our Crosby field. But let's compare the targeted planting depths with our actual planting depths. The 1 inch, 2 and 3 inch target depths corresponded to the actual depths were 1.1, 1.8, and 2.1 inches. And for the target depths for the other section of row that we looked at were 1.8, 2.8, and 3 inches, which were closer for some, but again, they were significantly different, but they were, again, shy of what we were shooting for. The daily average temperature was not different between the different depths in the Kokomo field. The average temperature range was was greatest at the 1 inch depth than the 3 inch depth, and the 2 inch depth was intermediate, 1.89 versus 12.1. The volumetric water content was lower at the 1 inch depth than it was at the 3 inch depth. The average volumetric water content range was greater at the 1 inch depth than it was at the 3 inch depth. So at the 1 inch depth, the volumetric water content was less than the other depths, and it was usually less than more often than we saw in the Crosby field. And the 2 and the 3 inch depths had very similar volumetric water content. These figures might look familiar because I showed you similar ones in the previous depth, and we saw something different here. This is contrary to what I would have expected, because in most of my work out at the Western Research Center, or Western Agriculture Research Branch, when I plant in fields which are Kokomo fields, I've always had the sense that the fields that are planted in Kokomo fields, which are darker, emerge much faster than the Crosby fields. We didn't see that here. So in these figures that show the relationship between cumulative emergence and emergent state for the V3 10-foot section and our R6 5-foot section, we saw something different. We saw that at the 1 inch depth, to go from the 10% emergence to 90% emergence, it was actually taking us longer, and also we were seeing it was taking us longer at the 3 inch depth. Not what we were seeing in the Crosby field. So we went from 4 to 4.5, and the 5-foot section of row, it was taking us 4 days to 5.5 as we went deeper. So we had a longer emergence window with increasing depth than in the Crosby field, not what I expected, and longer to reach the 50% emergence than in the Crosby field. We saw similar results for biomass and yield per plant versus emergence data in the Crosby field. Again, we take a look at similar figures that you saw for the Crosby field, but here looking at the relationship between biomass and depth and yield and depth. Here we didn't see the relationships we saw in the Crosby field. We didn't see, as far as our trend line, looking at the relationships, we didn't see a significant difference. And then when we were looking at actual planting depths, and then we were looking at targeted planting depths, again, we didn't see any relationship between biomass and planting depth, or for yield per plant and plot yield, or date emergence, date of emergence, average date of emergence for differences of planting depth. And this is the Kokomo field, our darker soil. So in conclusion, the lighter soil, the Crosby field, which the Crosby field exhibited, it exhibited faster emergence at the 3-inch planting depth. We saw at the 3-inch depth slower emergence in the darker soil. Delayed in emergence, decreased biomass and grain yield. There was a correlation existed between grain yield and actual planting depth. And this is the first year for this study. We're going to try to repeat at least 2 more years. Now, in closing, I want to point out that planting depth might be receiving attention and be perceived as maybe a critical factor as far as emergence, but certainly there are other factors that growers need to consider. And just a couple of those. I mean, obviously, selecting appropriate planting depths is important. And we certainly, I think, there's strong evidence out there. Shallow plantings are quite of questionable value. But I think other things to consider are row cleaning attachments. You can plant at the right depth, but if you have trash on top of a 2.5-inch planted seed, it's going to hurt your emergence. So row cleaning attachments can help manage uneven residue, cloddy surfaces. I think if you're in no-till or if you're considering reduced tillage, strip tillage may be an option for improving emergence. I think avoiding excessive tillage prior to planting, this is a good way to reduce surface crusting. Emerson, you had that neat picture that it showed the impact of downward pressure on your corn. It almost looked like a radish, one of those cover crop plants there you had there. But avoiding excessive downward pressure to minimize compaction on the top of the furrow. And avoid planting when sticky. Even extension agronomists are guilty of this when we get desperate to get an experiment study. I think last year I would have been much better off, if I'd known how the growing season unfolded, I would have been better off, like Mike when I planted that popcorn, waiting 2 weeks and planting in June. Soil conditions would have been much better, but when we're doing research studies, sometimes we're driven by the psychological May 31st deadline. We got to get that corn in May sometime, and we don't know what the forecast will bring. But avoid planting when soils are sticky and smearing the sidewalls with double disc openers. These are some of the other factors we need to consider to promote uneven emergence or to promote uniform emergence. We got funding from Pioneer to conduct this study, and if there's any questions, I'd be glad to, or comments, I'd like to hear them. Yeah, Emerson.
It strikes me that maybe the closing wheels don't work the same when you're planting at different depths. Is that and that seed soil contact may be affected.
Yeah, that's an interesting. Yeah, I want. That's something we were thinking about because we weren't seeing an impact on the 1-inch planting depth, but we were at the 3-inch depth. I don't know if at the 1-inch depth the soil dried out or if it got. And we were making it more dense by the time we were measuring down to 3 inches, and we were measuring at the. But yeah, that's something we're re-examining or re-evaluating our planting depth procedure. Harold?
Well, I know Alex, and I know he's particular.
Yeah.
So why didn't you get closer to the 1 inch and the 2 inch?
I think that there's some. I think there may be some technical issues like what Emerson was just mentioning, which could be a factor there.
Right.
I think that we would have seen some bigger differences in temperature. Is when we saw when we had rainfall. After every rainfall event, all those temperatures got close together, and when things started drying out in the first week of, those first few days of June, we had surface temperatures that we had. Like I didn't show the data from the Kokomo field. But this field also showed it. Like we had one day where the surface temperature, the 1-inch depth, it was 90 degrees, and the air temperature at that same time was 75 degrees. So I think if we had drier, cooler conditions, which I hope for next year, something more representative. Well, not more representative, because this is weather that is representative of many years. But I hope that would give us some contrast. Well, we had some of it this year, actually. Yeah. Yeah, we had that in this study. We actually met, and that was one reason, using that extended mesocotyl could be a problem. Now, we collected a massive amount of data, so we actually measured seedlings that exhibited that type of abnormality.
Wouldn't you be reducing your risk of that happening at the 3-inch depth?
You would think so. But I'm not, sometimes I know we collected that data, but I'm not sure. I'd like to, it would be nice, it would be kind of black and white if we saw that.